Good evening, Western Standard viewers, and welcome to the Hannaford Show. With me this week is Dr. Mark Milke, founder and president of the Aristotle Foundation. He is a frequent contributor to the pages of the Western Standard, and he, last year, or was it the year before, wrote a book on why Canada should be cherished, not cancelled. How's the book doing, Mark?
The 1867 Project, myself and 19 other authors, it's doing well. It sold 11,000 copies in Canada, which is pretty amazing for a book on history and a little bit about the existing problems we have in Canada as well. So no, the 1867 Project has done very, very well and still a bestseller. So that's the best you can hope for, and in Canada, and it's done well.
Mark, it's because of your particular focus on culture and Canadianism that I wanted you to come on and talk about a new story that we had in the last week. Our own Jen Hodgson wrote this piece up, but it was about a group that calls itself the Canadian AntiHate Network, and they made news because they alleged that some Catholic charities, pro-life charities, were actually hate groups, and they named a number of other organizations that they didn't approve of. It seems like a really strange organization, but they get money from the federal government. Can you who are we dealing with here? How much money do they get? And how can they contort things to make a Catholic charity into a hate group?
Well, they've been in the news before. Several years back, I think they got a grant for, I think it was 150,000 or 200,000 to produce a pamphlet for schools that basically, or at least part of it, said the red ensign, the old Canadian flag pre-1965, was also potentially a hate symbol or a symbol of white nationalism, or what else did they say? So they've been in the news before for that sort of thing. As far as I can tell, I mean, they're a government-funded lobby group, which that's exploded across the country in the last several decades. The idea of government funding for advocacy groups. And so, but this latest pamphlet they put out was really a 40-page rant accusing all sorts of groups, of potentially being involved in hate. Weirdly enough, I mean, they mention anti-Semitism, for example, but don't talk about the potential for, say, I don't know, Hamas sympathetic protesters to be a hate group. So, this Canadian Anti-Hate Network, and you got to love the name, I think are, kind of on an ideological bender, if I can put it that way. They're government funded, and they seem to think there's hate under every bed or around every tree. But that's in part what's being funded by governments these days, this notion that we're this deeply racist systemic society, as if Canada in 2024 was no different than, I don't know, Alabama in 1924.
Well, why would the federal government actually want to fund a group like that? I mean, it's one thing if you're, like, we think of anti-hate, we think of neo-Nazis and skinheads and, people who we really don't want to have dinner with. And yet they're talking, I know this group has once condemned parents who were running for school board because they didn't like the way that trans-sexualized education was being introduced into the curriculum. Oh, well, that was hate. So now pro-life is hate. Like, why would the government want to support that? I can see the neo-Nazi thing, but I can't see why they would approve grants to people who would say that perfectly nice, ordinary folks who are trying to do good are actually hate merchants.
Well, I guess if your view of the world is, again, that the main issue these days is racism, and not, say, high home prices or a lack of education for certain cohorts in society, right, where their situation would improve if they had a trade or a university degree, or that every difference in outcome that you see between X cohort and Y cohort must be due to hate or must be due to racism. If that's your view, then I guess you fund stuff that dovetails with that kind of view. And I think that's what the federal government, a lot in the federal government, people in the federal government, politically and perhaps in the bureaucracy, believe is that any difference, for example, between Indigenous Canadians and other Canadians in terms of average incomes must be due to hate or systemic discrimination or this sort of thing. Well, that's actually not really that defensible. What you find, for example, is that East Asian Canadians are at the top of the income heap. Guys with palettes like you and me are in the middle, and Indigenous Canadians and Black Canadians are at the bottom. But in part, that's explained by education levels. It's explained in part by how long a cohort, statistical cohort, has been in the country on average, or the majority of its members have been. Things like that, or how far an Indigenous Canadian is from opportunity and education. If you're on the middle of a reserve in northern Manitoba, chances are your economic opportunities are less, which in part explains your lower income on average. These things don't seem to matter, though, to the current federal government or others across the country in universities who also promote this view, which is very monocausal, that racism explains all differences in outcomes. Really? Nothing to do with geography, education, time in the country, whether you know French or English, this sort of thing. But that's the view of the federal government, and they fund a lot in universities, the SSHRC grants, advocacy groups like these to tell Canadians they're racist and that there's an explosion of potentially people with funny looking mustaches wearing brown shirts just around the corner, again as if this was 1937. That's the problem, is that there is this belief in some quarters that that's the main threat facing Canada today. It's ridiculous, and it doesn't actually deal with
what you're describing sounds very much like critical theory as espoused by Paulo Freire and some of the other philosophers of that genre from the Frankfurt School of the 1930s. What you're saying is that this has infected the federal government in a very big way.
Yes, and you see it in their funding. I mean, we've looked at some of the grants to the Social Humanities and Research Council, known as SSHRC. We've looked at some of the funding for advocacy groups like this, self-proclaimed AntiHate network, which is ridiculous. When you use things like anti-hate or anti-racism, if you're going to use terms like that, not you, Nigel, but groups like this, then you better be Martin Luther King, because he was engaged in anti-hate and anti-racism, the actual kind, not the fake kind, that sees a thread around every tree or blames every difference in outcomes on racism. No, but you're right. Part of this originates with this notion that's been prevalent for some time in the universities, and you're right, came from Marxists in the Frankfurt School and others, is that there's no physical or other structural realities out there, that everything is imposed. In other words, you can create your own reality, just like the Marxists used to think with economies. We'll just make everyone happy, fat, and free from the top down. No, that's anti-reality. And in our century, we have other anti-reality people, again, who ignore data, ignore statistics, ignore nuanced explanations. And in this case, I guess they go after groups that they just disagree with, whether it's in this case, it's a pro-life group, but it could be a different government funding, attacks on pro-choice groups. So what's distressing is that government shouldn't be funding any groups. Let people, argue it out in the public square. Don't get involved in funding one side or the other. Fund good data and leave it at that. But governments these days, of various political stripes, not just the current one federally, seem to think they can solve stuff through taking tax dollars, putting them in a room with ostensibly smart people or well-intentioned people who don't like hate, like most people do, or something, and that'll solve a problem. It won't. It actually just ramps up perhaps misconceptions.
How many people are involved in this anti-hate network?
Not sure, to be honest. So again, I briefed through their 40-page document, which I think was actually taken from an American or amended some American rant. And it's from this network. It's a 40-page document that sees threats everywhere as defined by extreme hate. However you define that. I mean, I think it's a bit like the former Supreme Court justice. You kind of, like the definition of pornography. It might be hard to define, but you kind of know it when you see it. You know when someone's being a jerk or being hateful. But to suppose, which is the basis for the $600,000 grant, your tax dollars and mine and everyone else's, to fund a rant against groups they don't like, and assume that everyone's full of hate. Look, I mean, I think the problem there again is they're kind of, I think, ignoring some other realities that are around the corner today in an obvious view. When you see people that are arguably anti-Semitic, or at the very least anti-Israel, and possibly pro-Hamas, marching on our streets in the past year since October the 7th, I think that's a greater problem than some guy that might admire in the back of his mind Adolf Hitler. That's a problem too. but I actually don't think that's a great threat in Canada these days. I think that was dealt with 80 years ago, and you'd have to be a lunatic to think Nazism and the notion of race purity is a good idea. I'm sure there's a few people like that around, but I don't think they're quite equal to some of the anti-Semitism we've been seeing spilling out in the streets, and which this particular group has been pretty mute on.
So how many groups are I think it's Heritage Canada that actually funnels the money to a group like the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. My recollection of Heritage Canada at the time that I served in Ottawa was that, in fact, they put out a citizenship guide, which was very much in tune with what the 1867 project was all about. It encouraged people to be proud of Canada and talked about the history and so on. I'm sure that's long gone. And now you have, within that bureaucracy, you have this group of people who, we'll call them woke for want of a better, more accessible term, but really is all deeply embedded in this critical theory. And it's like they want there to be hate so that they can react to it. And I would propose, you may disagree, but what they do is they find somebody to tell them that there is hate. They react to the hate with new rules, regulations, possibly even restrictions on the use of the internet by ordinary people, as we have seen under the Online Harms Act just passed. Now, is this what is going on? Are they actually running the propaganda ministry?
Well, perhaps. Look, I think people by nature are control freaks, right? Power corrupts, absolute power corrupts, absolutely, as Lord Acton said. So there's always a temptation when you're in government or in a position of power, or you've got a budget in a ministry to fund stuff you think should be funded. But there was a political scientist, I think it was Leslie Powell, about 20 or 25 years ago, and I forget the name of the book, but his basic thesis was, as compared to the past, in a very kind of classic liberal society, where the idea was government should be arbiters but not be involved in the ring. They should be the judges. They should be of what's happening in the boxing ring, so to speak, but they shouldn't be in the boxing ring, funding one boxer or another, or in this case, in other words, one citizen group or advocacy group or think tank over another, right? They should enforce the rule of law. They should, make sure that people have access to information, that sort of thing. But they shouldn't be taking sides as a government, as an institution, funding sides in a debate. And it doesn't matter what the debate is. Let people think it out and argue it out. But once you have governments massively funding one side, in a five-sided argument, then that's what people start to think is the main issue. And these days, it apparently is this notion that, again, we're institutionally, systemically racist, as if nothing has changed in a century, as if, in fact, that's the main causal explanation for a lot of outcomes that you see. As I mentioned a moment ago, no, if you're Indigenous Canadian, on average, your income is lower, except if you do an apples to apples comparison, where, if you're between 25 and 34, have a university degree, work full time, guess what? Your income is exactly the same as every other Canadian who has that sort of makeup. So, but you're dealing with people that, again, have this, it's almost a conspiratorial belief about racism that, again, it's reared its ugly head in a way that ignores the obvious. It has in some quarters. If you're trained in Gaza all of your life, the Jews are a problem, and you show up in Montreal, guess what? That's what you're seeing expressed in Montreal these days and in some other cities. So maybe if you're going to analyze a problem like racism or modern versions of anti-Semitism or hate, maybe look at that. But as a general principle, I don't think government should be certainly funding what I think is a faulty, flawed analysis of current problems in our society. I think civil society organizations should be debating that out, as should universities and academics, who are also funded to a great degree to tell us we're all racists.
Mark, the last time I looked on the Heritage Canada website, I think there were quite a few of these groups. They're all getting, I think this one's probably getting one of the larger grants, but 200,000 here, 150,000 there, tell us how bad things are. And then, of course, this validates government action. This actually, I want to take you, Mark, to another thing that's been in the news recently, and that was the surprising choice of a man by the name of Tatani to lead the Human Rights Commission. The Canadian Human Rights Commission, of course, arbitrates places where people think they've been discriminated against on, I don't know how many grounds of discrimination there are now. There's more every year, certainly. At any rate, this gentleman had connected himself with some anti-Semitic propaganda, anti-Semitic groups. How does somebody who actually holds that point of view come to be chosen to arbitrate human rights disputes in Canada? What went wrong there?
Well, I mean, I've read the same headlines.
Intentional. What's
Yeah, as far as you have. And, it appears that they didn't know he had a second name, maybe his real name, but certainly had an alternate name. And, didn't disclose that at the time he was being interviewed or, vetted for the job. So that was part of the problem. And again, if you come from the belief, as some do these days, that you can be categorized or as a victim or, as an oppressor by your skin color, ethnicity, heritage, this sort of thing, and that's what matters. And that's how you define, what's actually racism or not. If you come from that viewpoint, then I guess it's no surprise when you hire people that you think are, in quotes, victimized, and therefore they have a moral leg up on some other group or person. But that's a silly way to hire a person for a Canadian Human Rights Commission position. I'm not sure, by the way, that these human rights commissions or human rights tribunals should exist. They've long been a problem. And I suppose the only argument for them is that, they say people who are actually discriminated against, in the workplace or something, expensive, lawyer fees. But I'm not sure that they should exist, frankly, because I think, again, they promote the notion, that the main problem is discrimination these days, as opposed to, say, a lack of opportunity or affordable housing, or a brain drain to the rest of the world, which we're experiencing, or the deep problem of beliefs that are anti-Semitic, among some. So I'm not sure that these human rights commissions or human rights tribunals are all that useful. They're costly, they become controversial. This particular fellow, appeared to have snuck in through deceit.
Say again, he did what?
He apparently, he looks like he snuck in through deceit.
Well, I guess there's not much to be done if people are actively trying to deceive you, but it does seem that there is a problem with screening of prospective people for anything at the moment. We have the other case that's very current at the moment, where two men were apprehended in Toronto by the police. They are charged with crimes under the terrorism sections of the Canadian Criminal Code. There's a ban on publication of details and so forth. But it's out there, and I think we can safely say that one of these individuals had been featured in an ISIS snuff film, if you want to call it that. At any rate, he left ISIS, came to Canada, became a citizen. In this day when we've got facial recognition technology and all the resources of the internet, again, is there a problem with vetting and screening in Ottawa?
Well, there is, isn't there? And in fact, we've got a problem in terms of expelling people. You almost can't in Canada. I just read a headline, I think it was last night, I believe it was France, that expelled an imam for radical views. Right? He wasn't a French citizen, and the French were able to deport him like within 12 hours of his anti-Semitic speech. So I don't know how France does it and we don't, how they're able to. But I think there's something to that. I think what's not understood these days, Nigel, in part, is beliefs matter, right? And you can have deep beliefs. And if you're inculcated for much of your life in ISIS-type beliefs or Taliban-type beliefs that women don't have equal rights, they should cover themselves up, and that you're going to meet 70 virgins or 72 virgins in the afterlife. If you actually believe this stuff, if you're actually inculcated in this stuff, and you think Jews are somehow controlling the world, you have some conspiratorial belief there. If this is what you're inculcated in for years and decades, and then you arrive in a country that says, well, no, actually, we treat people as individuals, women can do what they want. You've got a clash of cultures, or Samuel Huntington called a clash of civilizations. It doesn't mean there aren't plenty of exceptions to that rule. I wrote years ago in the Globe and Mail that what you want, the kind of immigrants you want, for example, you want a 30-year-old female physician from Islamabad who believes in equal rights for women. What you don't want, with due respect to, those over a certain age, is you don't want the 75-year-old or 65-year-old male from Northwest Pakistan who thinks women should be covered or don't have equal rights, or will kill them if they choose their own boyfriend or spouse. So, but we've got a problem in the immigration system, apparently. It's gone off the rails, and I'm pro-immigration, and I think you want to unite people around ideas, not skin color, not ethnicity, not their background. The classic liberal ideal, which ironically Pierre Trudeau understood better than his son, that you want to treat people as individuals, and use a merit-based policy in hiring, and also think about who you're bringing in. So, we should be bringing in the best, the best and the brightest from around the world who can contribute to Canada, and share what has been the classical liberal ideas that this country was founded on: the worth of the individual, the equal rights of women, the growing consensus over the last 150 plus years that you can succeed here regardless of where you're from, or regardless of your skin color or gender. But that seems to be breaking down again, in part because we've got people that are very tribal for various reasons, and that's concerning.
Mark, it is just one of the curious things that we can be sitting here and lamenting that actually things were better under Pierre Trudeau. And
the ironies of history, Nigel.
You make the case that he actually had more of the classical liberal tradition guiding him, even though people said he was a communist. And I think he did hang out with communists. But nevertheless, when it came to the application of the law, he treated people as individuals and was something of a libertarian. Look, this has been a fascinating discussion, Mark. How do people respond when they see these things? Is there anything that they can do? Do you write to your MP and complain?
Well, look, I think it's hard to say what individuals should do. I mean, raise your family well, that sort of thing. Of course, vote, get involved in politics if that's your thing. Follow us at the Aristotle Foundation, right? I mean, we founded this to try and promote reason, democracy, and civilization. There's a lot under those three things: reason, democracy, civilization. But I think, civilization is always, it must be nurtured and protected. It's like an oak tree. You want the oak tree to survive because it can protect so many people underneath it, so to speak. And it's a beautiful creation. So we've got to be careful about things that can injure the oak tree, or in this case, the oak tree that is Canada, the civilization that is Canada. So however people contribute to that, by loving those around them, by giving their kids a good, solid education that's based in reality, acting responsibly too. We haven't talked about that today, Nigel, but a lot of people emphasize rights these days, and I'm happy to do so, and freedoms, but people also need to act responsibly, right? And from every community. And there's a breakdown in the responsibility ethos, I'd argue, these days. But look, I mean, follow us at the Aristotle Foundation and find out what we're up to. I mean, that's why we founded this organization, to try and bring some sanity on some of these crazy issues to Canada.
Well, and you're certainly doing that, Mark. In a way, you kind of circled us back to where we began, because you're recommending that people make sure that their kids receive a proper education and learn to respect the things that matter and the things that are proven to work. And yet when they do that, they find groups funded by the government working against them. This is the world we live in, is it not?
Unfortunately, it is. Look, I like to be an optimist. Nothing goes on forever. And I think fundamentally, we've got two problems these days. One is anti-reality in a number of areas. And the second is a not terribly nuanced view of history. And the latter has been used to beat up the present. And there's lots of anti-reality thinking these days. And so I think part of the challenge is to say, okay, and this is why I don't care about politics, or in that sense, if people have bad ideas or anti-reality ideas, then eventually it's like poison in the lake above a dam. You get yellow down in the fields below. You don't get growth. You don't get green trees. You don't get fields and farms. So we've got to be careful what we're putting in the lake up above the dam, in the education system, universities. When you're trying to solve a problem, find out what the core problem is and debate that, whether people are in touch with reality. But there's a lot of anti-reality thinking out there these days. And I think that's part of the challenge. And, it comes with an internet, and a 24/7 news cycle and the rest of it. People don't know who to believe or who to trust. I think that's part of the challenge, is we live in an anti-reality age, and also one that thinks all their problems are due to something that happened 150 years ago in terms of their historical perspective. And I think those are again, are the two things we try and address at the Aristotle Foundation: informed or nuanced history, and promote that, and critical thinking, which is actual critical thinking, not going along with the herd when we think the herd is wrong.
Dr. Mark Milke, you do great work down there at the Aristotle Foundation. Thank you very much for coming on the program today and explaining how the government sometimes tries to undo the work you're doing.
Thank you, Nigel.
For the Western Standard, I'm Nigel Hannaford.
If the name Ted Byfield brings back fond memories, well, we got a party coming up for you guys. On September 25th, Toasting Ted is what it's called. It's going to honor a great conservative who published Alberta Report news magazine. There's going to be bagpipes, singing, live auction stakes, speeches by Premier Smith, Preston Manning, Stephen Harper, quite a lineup. The Western Standard is the final incarnation, or the latest incarnation, of Alberta Report that Ted Byfield founded. And I mean, he was a great Albertan. He really made his mark on this province, and this evening of celebration for him is really going to be outstanding. You get there, toastingted.ca. That's the website. You can get your tickets. This one's going to sell out. I mean, again, if you want to see Smith, Manning, Harper, all in one spot, one night, be sure to get there.